wolf, take my blood and live again.
Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is my favorite game I've ever played. My first playthrough of Sekiro is by far the best experience I've ever had with a video game. The game is near perfect, from the combat system to the environments to the progression, all of it's just amazing. Today I'm gonna look back on Sekiro and see what made it so special. I'm gonna try to break this video into two parts. In the first part, I'm gonna talk about the combat / gameplay, and in the second part, I'm gonna talk about the world of Sekiro. But first, I'm gonna give a little context. Sekiro takes place in a fictionalized version of Japan during the Sengoku period. The story follows a shinobi named Wolf as he attempts to get revenge on the clan that kidnapped his lord, a young boy named Kuro. Kuro has given Wolf the ability to resurrect himself upon death, making Wolf immortal. Sekiro is heavily inspired by the game series Tenchu and the Japanese manga Blade of the Immortal, a series about a samurai who tries to sever his immortality. Just looking through the manga right now, I can see a lot of concepts that carried over to Sekiro, as well as maybe some moves that they may have added in based on the manga itself. Very cool. When Sekiro was first announced, many people had high expectations, seeing as it was being developed by From Software, who is famous for making games like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Elden Ring, and Adventures of Cookies and Cream. Many expected Sekiro to be another Dark Souls clone, but since it's set in Japan, you could do cool stuff like fight snakes, use katanas, and become the amazing Spider-Man. Sekiro keeps a lot of the basics of a From Software title, like a focus on mythology, unforgiving, challenging boss battles, and sickly old people. But where Sekiro really stood out as a From Software game was its movement. Sekiro chooses to abandon the Dark Souls dodge roll, instead focusing on a completely new combat system which revolves around blocking and parrying, adding a new feature called the posture bar. I'm gonna go more into the combat system in a separate section later on in the video, but all you need to know right now is that the combat was good enough to win a Game of the Year. Sekiro won Game of the Year in 2019 despite coming out in an absolutely stacked year with games like Jedi Fallen Order, Devil May Cry 5, Borderlands 3. Someone should make a video on that game. And of course, all-time classic, NHL 20.
These are the scariest games I've ever played.
The Souls combat requires the player to memorize an enemy moveset and react to it in real time. Most enemies deal large amounts of damage, punishing the player for messing up a dodge. This causes you to be more aware of the surroundings and tools at your disposal. There isn't just one way to play a Souls game, as the player is allowed to choose their weapon of choice, increase their attributes, and decide whether they want to use magic or not. But no matter how you play the game, the combat requires skill and patience. In addition to having the skill to dodge enemy attacks, the player also needs to have the ability to judge when the time is right for them to get a hit in. But when you are able to finally defeat the boss after many attempts, the dopamine rush is massive. While simple in concept, the Soulsborne combat has always been challenging and multifaceted. But most importantly, it allows you to prove that you're superior to everyone else, cause Chad doesn't know what the fuck a bonfire is. The system has been around since Demon Souls and has been proven to fit into the intricate and mystical worlds presented in From Software games. But this has led the combat to become stale for some players, making the overall experience of playing a new From Software game less enjoyable. Everyone remembers that distinct feeling that they got when they first picked up a Soul game. Starting out small in a hostile world where you had to adapt and learn how to defeat the enemies. Seeing just how outmatched you were in boss battles and grinding hard to finally get good. It took a long time, but when you finally defeated that boss that you've been struggling on for hours and hours and have died to time and time again, that feeling is absolutely unmatched when you beat him. And for many longtime Souls players, Sekiro brings back that fresh feeling. Sekiro's combat system is based around blocking and parrying enemy attacks. Each enemy is given a posture bar that fills up the more and more attacks that are parried. This gives players two options. 1. Whittle down the enemy's health slowly over time and kill them the old-fashioned way. Or 2. Break their posture and get the death blow. Sekiro has fewer role-playing elements and lacks the ability to create a character. This means you can no longer cosplay as Guts from Berserk. But this doesn't mean that Sekiro doesn't have ability customization. At the beginning of the game, the player character Wolf loses his arm in battle. Wolf is taken in by an older shinobi who replaces his severed arm with a prosthetic. This prosthetic gives Wolf new abilities that aid him in his journey to find his lord Kuro. He can use a metal umbrella to block attacks, use fireworks to distract beasts, fists, throw shurikens at enemies that are far away, and become the amazing Spider-Man. The shinobi prosthetic has 10 different abilities in total, and each has about 3 to 4 iterations, adding things like increased range or elemental damage. Each prosthetic ability can be useful in a specific situation. Some bosses are more susceptible to different iterations of the prosthetic. This allows for a variety in combat despite not having the character customization of games of the past. Now, the point of this section isn't to argue which game is better, Dark Souls or Sekiro. I think both combat systems are amazing and perfectly fit into each game respectively. Now, with that being said, let's move on to talking about the world of Sekiro. From Software has always been known for the vast spectacle of their open worlds, providing the player with jaw-dropping mythical locations. And Sekiro is no different. Sekiro is set in Japan during the Sengoku period, a time of bloody battles and unrest. The world of Sekiro shows the effect that immortality has on humans. Many are miserable and hungry, fighting an endless battle. While achieving a more realistic feel, Sekiro doesn't abandon the mythical elements seen in other From Software titles, filled with ogres, dragons, and giants. Each new location that the player explores is absolutely breathtaking. Many From Software games in the past have had a more depressing tone, with Dark Souls feeling a lot more gothic. While other games have felt dead, Sekiro feels more tranquil. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about every single location that Sekiro has to offer, for one, we'd be here for way too long, and I don't have that much space. So let's just agree to keep this short and sweet. So in this section, I'm going to be talking about Fountainhead Palace. After fighting a corrupted illusion, finding some dumbass flower, and nearly getting crushed to death, an enormous being made out of rope carries you to the gates of the Fountainhead Palace. Apparently, these beings are called Shiminawa, and they're usually used in purification rituals. In Japanese, Shiminawa means enclosing rope. Upon arriving at Fountainhead Palace, you're immediately greeted by a corrupted monk, tasked with guarding the gates. This leads to one of the best boss battles in the game presentation-wise. The music swells as you battle the corrupted monk atop the bridge connecting the spiritual world to the physical. Eventually, you're able to defeat him and sever his immortality. After defeating the corrupted monk, the player enters the palace gates. These Japanese gates, tori, usually signify that you're entering a holy area or a shrine. Once you pass through the gate, you're treated to this absolutely beautiful view. A village perched atop a waterfall surrounded by sakura trees. From Software has always been able to create worlds of spectacle despite not having the most impressive of graphics. And this is no different, as you can't help but stare for just a couple of seconds before entering. This is just one of those areas you have to take a screenshot of. But despite the beautiful surroundings and architecture, you can see that the castle is decaying. Entire buildings are destroyed and moss is growing from the rooftops. Even the enemies you face inside the palace seem corrupt. I think this is one of the greatest concepts in a From Software game to this day. A once beautiful celestial palace destroyed and left to rot. Now, I'd like to backtrack a little bit and talk about the enemies that you actually encounter within the palace, because they're some of the most interesting and visually impressive in the game. The two enemies that you'll encounter the most throughout the palace are the Okami and this flute fucker. Aside from looking like Kevin Durant, what makes the Okami special is they actually have 4 different variants. Some use melee weapons, some use bows, and some juggle balls that they can use to attack you. This is a reference to an old Japanese game called Suju. Not counting the big ass carp, the Fountainhead Palace has 3 total mini bosses, and all of them are basically copy pasted from an earlier point in the game or just a variant of an earlier mini boss. This is probably Sekiro's biggest issue, is they kind of just recycle a lot of mini bosses and sometimes even some main story bosses with stuff like the Guardian Ape and kind of Genichiro. But mini rant aside, let's actually talk about these bosses. The most boring boss is the Shichiman Warrior, as he's basically copy pasted from the Ashina Depths. I don't know, I've just never been a really big fan of this boss. But the Sakura Bull, on the other hand, I like this one. And well, yes, I did just complain about recycling mini bosses in Sekiro. This one's an exception. In my opinion, this boss fight is much more enjoyable than the first one. The arena looks beautiful. You're fighting in this like little kiddie pool. The boss itself looks absolutely stunning. I mean, just look at this thing. And the 2 boss fights take place far enough apart. So overall, it's pretty good. Now on to the Headless. Imagine you took your Thanksgiving turkey, gave it a knife, and then gave it 400 milligrams of Adderall, and then put that bitch underwater. It's not very fun. Now, when I was first recording, I actually forgot to mention the Okami leader Shinzu. He makes it a pain in the ass to run around the map, but it's not that hard to kill him. He's whatever. But let's move on to talk about the Great Colored Carp. This is kind of a mini boss, kind of not. It can only damage you when you're in the underwater part of the map. In Japanese mythology, the koi is a symbol of luck, prosperity, and good fortune. So you have to kill it. But it's okay, because that fish had teeth. Now let's move on to the absolute highlight of the Fountainhead Palace. It only makes sense that one of the most divine, beautiful locations in the game is topped off with an amazing boss fight. While the Divine Dragon is far from the hardest boss fight in the game, it makes up for it by presenting the player with one of the most visually stunning boss fights in a From Software title. I believe that Sekiro is at its absolute best when it's embracing its Japanese mythology. After all, From Software Studios is based in Japan. It just feels so much more genuine, and it leads to them creating some of the most unbelievable, almost fairy tale-like locations and boss fights. One of the themes of Sekiro is religion, specifically Buddhism, and another religion called Shinto, practiced in the feudal era. This can be seen in the game's architecture with a lot of temples and large statues. Hell, I mean, the way you travel in the game is through Buddha statues. Now, I can't talk about the world of Sekiro without mentioning the music. Sekiro's soundtrack is absolutely phenomenal, using traditional Japanese instruments to create the signature grandiose sound of a From Software game. The soundtrack does a great job of keeping the player on edge while exploring, and you can really hear the passion bleeding through into the music.
This time, the themes that we were given weren't just Japan, it was thinking about the Sengoku period, this period of war and conflict, thinking about the specific culture, which is sort of an esoteric Buddhist approach to the religious aspects of Japan.
Another really cool element of Sekiro's soundtrack is that it's made to sync up and fuse with the gameplay. This is really cool and just adds another level of immersion to an already great game, and just shows the extra amount of effort that the team went through when creating this soundtrack. Sekiro's soundtrack is also very good at utilizing the theme of every single location. Here's an example. In Sekiro, there's a location called the Sunken Valley. The Sunken Valley is occupied by an extremely large snake which seems to be worshipped in the area, and occasionally in the Sunken Valley soundtrack you can actually hear rattles. This adds another layer of immersion to the game and just keeps the player a little bit more on edge. Overall, Sekiro's soundtrack is just beautiful, and I think it's extremely underrated. And now, I can't make a review on Sekiro without mentioning the voice acting. It's absolutely phenomenal. You can tell that everyone's putting their heart and soul into every performance. Just absolutely beautiful. During my first playthrough of the game, I played Sekiro in Japanese with English subtitles to get the most authentic experience I could, and I thought the two most standout performances were Ishin and Genichiro. But like I said earlier on, everyone just does a phenomenal job. And it's no secret that voice acting in video games more often than not sounds like a middle school production of The Lion King.
You're right. He's right. We got too much talent and we work too hard to be playing like this. We got to get this train right back on track real quick like.
That's right. We all have that attitude. The train will be rolling in no time. Let's do it.
But with Sekiro, that's just not the case. I mean, just listen to this.
My name is Kyobu Masataka Oniwa! As I breathe, you will not have the escape!
Now, I'm actually not going to talk about Sekiro's story in this video, and that's partially because I don't want to spoil it for anyone who wants to play the game for themselves. But it's also because it's a From Software game and the story doesn't make any sense unless you play it by yourself. So I just kind of wanted to explain myself so you're not wondering why I left it out. And now with that being said, let's move on to the final section. In conclusion, Sekiro is still a masterpiece. And if you haven't played the game yet, I hope that this video was able to convince you to try it out. And I hope that you just enjoyed watching this video in general. Thank you if you made it to the end. I really appreciate it. And sorry that this video took so long to make. I've been sick. I haven't been feeling as well. That's why my voice kind of sounds like shit in this video. But I'm going to be making a lot more videos in the future, so stick around, subscribe if you liked what you saw today. And I guess I'll see you around. Bye. Thanks, Evan.